Our protagonist had an exceptional talent with a sword. There was nothing he couldn't learn and nothing could escape his blade. He worked so hard that he often had bloodstains on his palms. After dropping out of high school, he spent 20 years honing his skills with a knife, becoming the best swordsman in the country. The waiter shouted that table 3 Zamike's Corsa was ready. In the busy restaurant, the waiters heard an alarm inside the kitchen, momentarily pausing their work. Meanwhile, our protagonist was inside the kitchen, wearing earpads, focused on cutting a fish. One of the waiters excused himself and approached him, saying the phone alarm had been going off. Our protagonist realized he'd set it to vibrate. When he looked at his phone, he saw a notification from a game, making him wonder if it was the one he had deleted earlier and if something was wrong with it. The waiter informed him that a guest had arrived, to which our protagonist instructed the waiter to say he wasn't there. Moments later, a man entered the kitchen and pointed out he wasn't buying the excuse. A chubby man entered, stating that it was time for our protagonist to give his answer. He believed he'd given our protagonist enough time to think and insisted it shouldn't be a difficult request for someone who handles swords daily. When our protagonist didn't respond, the chubby man laughed and accused him of being insensitive. He ordered his men to bring forward a suitcase, saying the requester should show sincerity first. A man opened the suitcase, revealing it was full of money. The chubby man proudly announced it was an advance payment of $300 million, and if our protagonist completed the task properly, there would be more. Without a word, the protagonist swiftly swung his knife, slicing through a large fish hanging in front of him, horrifying the chubby man. The protagonist calmly told him that the kitchen was a place where cleanliness was paramount, and it wasn't for someone as dirty as the chubby man. He then ordered him to leave, as pieces of fish slammed onto the floor. The chubby man, stunned, shouted that the protagonist really was the sword saint, as he expected. He grabbed his sharper knife from the counter in anger, making his men step back in fear. The chubby man, along with his bodyguards, stormed out of the kitchen. Before leaving the restaurant, the chubby man warned the protagonist not to think he was giving up, promising he'd be back soon. Later, after the restaurant had closed, the protagonist was out back, smoking. His co-worker joined him, saying the down payment was 300 million won and that if it were him, he would have accepted it on the spot. The co-worker asked why he turned it down. The protagonist replied that all his life, he had only sliced fish heads with a knife and asked his co-worker what he knew about being a thug. His co-worker suggested that he was just using his reputation as a swordmaster and wondered if he was seriously planning to kill someone. He advised the protagonist to scare them enough to get the money, buy a house, and open a shop, telling him he needed to live like a human too. But the protagonist simply replied that even if they offered billions, he would still pass. Suddenly, his phone received another notification. His co-worker teased him, asking if he was dating someone because of all the notifications. The protagonist replied it was a game. His co-worker asked if he was still playing Divine Protection, to which he admitted he quit. Just then, someone called out, asking where they were going without cleaning up. His co-worker told him it was their boss and that he was leaving first. Alone, the protagonist smoked, thinking back to when he was young. His family went bankrupt and since then, he'd been working non-stop. He guessed he'd been too focused on earning money, but his phone kept buzzing, the notifications becoming excessive. Annoyed, he pulled out his phone, wondering why it kept ringing. He briefly thought he might have reinstalled the game after a night of drinking, deciding to delete it again. He chuckled when he saw a message about the Demon King's invasion of the academy, knowing those guys had been invading the academy for years. But then, accidentally, he clicked on the game. It opened with a welcome song, and the game prompted him to touch the screen to enter. Nostalgic, he noted that the soundtrack was still the same, and the female characters were still as beautiful as ever. Suddenly, the screen became corrupt. Was it lag? Before he could react, a bright, powerful light shot out of the phone, sucking him in. Moments later, his co-worker came out of the restaurant, looking for him. The co-worker saw the protagonist's phone lying on the ground and wondered where he had gone, puzzled that he left his phone behind. The boss yelled from inside, asking where the chef was. The co-worker, unaware of what had happened, joked that it seemed like the chef went to the bathroom, not knowing he had been sucked into the game, now with a 100% transfer complete displayed on the screen. There was nothing special about the game, just a typical pay-to-win model with an auto-hunting system, a mass-produced mobile game that needed no further explanation. Our protagonist played it for one reason. He was captivated by the female characters' appearances. He got swallowed up by the game, finding it ironic that he ended up spending a fortune on it. After playing through multiple cycles, he wasn't even a playable character anymore, not even an NPC. Instead, he became a background character whose whereabouts were unknown. In that world, his name was Kong Jio-ma. One day, he accidentally bumped into someone and when he turned around, surprised, he saw it was a woman. He quickly asked if she was okay and she replied that she was fine. Fortunately for him, the game Divine Protection was set in Korea. The names, locations, and geography were all the same, with only minor differences in a few characters. The similarities helped him adapt easily, and for a year, he lived in that world, forgetting whether it was a game or reality, enjoying a life he couldn't experience in his previous one. That was, until that fateful day. He returned to his apartment, where his parents welcomed him, calling him their pride, the great swordmaster, and showed him an acceptance letter to a prestigious academy. He asked his parents if they could put it away, but they insisted, saying no matter how many times they saw it, they were proud of how well they had raised him. His mother then asked if he had packed everything, to which he replied that he'd finish soon. His mother excitedly told him to go ahead. That day, his modest dream of living a normal life shattered into pieces. He sighed in his room, knowing the day was almost here. He had asked countless times if he could avoid it, but nothing changed. Tired, he began packing his things, thinking about how happy everyone was. He couldn't refuse. Looking at their family photo, he wondered how Kang Jeoma had gotten accepted into such a prestigious school. His father once told him that his divine power had manifested last year, and he took the entrance exam right after. His mother had asked if he didn't remember. Before he possessed Kang Jeoma, that divine power had already appeared, allowing him to pass the entrance exam to Hokan Academy. Staring at the acceptance letter, he wondered if the real Kang Jeoma was a genius. Divine power was a special ability that humans could use, much like skills in a game. However, not all humans possess divine power, as it is usually inherited genetically. Society was divided into 3 segments based on this: the privileged, the commoners, and the poor. Hokan Academy was born to maintain the power of the elite. Though it was established under the pretense of hero cultivation, it had long since become a school exclusive to upper-class families. Recently, a special admission system was introduced for non-hero families, and Kang Jeoma was admitted as one of those students. He wondered why heroes were still necessary, though he knew the answer: the Demon King. He mused that this world wasn't reality, but training heroes for war felt too real. It reminded him of what it would feel like to re-enlist. He called forth his divine power, and a system window popped up in front of him, still feeling unfamiliar. Looking at the divine power Kang Jeoma had unlocked, he saw it was painlessness, which reduced pain for 30 seconds with a 12-hour cooldown. He couldn't believe he had crossed into this world with something so underwhelming. Every time he saw it, it depressed him. It was nonsense. But then he remembered the divine power he had been granted when he possessed Kang Jeoma's body, the blessing of the sword god. Its activation time was infinite, without a cooldown, but it only worked with a sword less than 30 centimeters long and 5 centimeters wide. He was in disbelief he had the blessing of the sword god, and his name, Kang Jeoma, literally meant blood demon. He wondered if the universe was playing a joke on him. He'd never encountered such a blessing in the game and thought the elaborate name clashed with the ridiculously simple effect. It seemed absurd to even call it a divine power. But what stood out most was the activation condition: a sword less than 30 centimeters long and less than 5 centimeters wide. It was clearly referring to a sashimi knife. Were they implying he should cut sashimi in this world, too? Frustrated, he realized life never went as planned. He then asked himself if he had packed everything. Suddenly, he remembered he had forgotten his equipment. In the game, even the lowest grade E-rank weapon cost tens of millions of won, while an average C-rank cost hundreds of millions. That meant rank and S-rank items were treasures in themselves. He knew the tuition alone was exorbitant, and he didn't want to spend money on something he was being pushed into. Yet, the academy required equipment, and if he showed up without anything, he'd leave a bad impression on the first day. Sighing, he decided to visit Daikso. As he stood up and walked out of his room, he recalled his first master, who insisted on using a Japanese sashimi knife worth over 100 million won, often saying, "A true master never blames their equipment." On the day of the entrance ceremony, where the student's equipment was inspected, he stood in uniform, staring at the instructor in confusion. The instructor looked at the sashimi knives on the counter and asked if they were really his weapons. He replied calmly, "Yes." The instructor, thinking it was a prank pulled by upper-class students, felt the need to establish discipline. He then shouted, asking if the academy was a joke and if the student truly believed a kitchen knife was an acceptable weapon for the class placement test. Remaining composed, he simply repeated, "It's my weapon." The instructor, stunned for a moment, angrily addressed him as student. But he calmly explained, he's a special student from a modest family. The tuition alone must have been a huge burden on his parents, and he couldn't possibly afford an expensive weapon on top of that. Hearing his explanation, the instructor noticed the color of his tag, which indicated his status as a special admission student. Those from non-upper-class backgrounds, understanding the financial burden of the tuition, were taken aback. He found it shocking that an institution supposedly promoting equal education rights would push away such a sincere, filial student. The young man then spoke with gravity, saying, "Blaming your equipment is something only amateurs do." The instructor froze for a moment, knowing the phrase, "A master never blames their tools." Such words didn't seem fitting for a teenage boy, and the instructor felt that Jeoma had already reached mastery in some aspect of life. His unyielding spirit carried the weight of someone who had lived far beyond his years. It was almost as if a god stood before him. With that, the instructor approved his weapon, and Jeoma thanked him. Meanwhile, some upper-class students glared at Jeoma in anger, outraged that a special admission student like him had even made it to the academy. They whispered among themselves, asking how someone like him could possibly belong there. But before any commotion could arise, the instructor shouted for them to be quiet and told the students that once the evaluation was over, they were to move swiftly and promptly. As Jeoma walked past the line, the instructor sternly reminded everyone that, depending on their actions, he could be their angel or their devil. Hearing this, Jeoma felt a wave of post-traumatic stress disorder from his past as the words echoed in his mind. A moment later, Jeoma decided to take a break and sit down on a bench, reflecting. He expected hostility but still found it unsettling to experience firsthand. Regardless, he had completed the equipment inspection and survived the entrance ceremony. Now, the only thing left was the class placement exam. Looking around at the academy, he still couldn't believe he had made it here. This was the school he'd be attending for the next 3 years, the Hero Training School, Hoken Academy. As he took in the impressive size of the campus, he thought it was much grander than the game graphics had shown. If he exaggerated, it felt as large as a small town. Smiling to himself, he felt a sense of surrealism. He was attending a school meant for the upper class, something unimaginable back when he had to drop out of high school due to his family's financial struggles on Earth. Suddenly, an announcement instructed students to gather at the training hall by 1 p.m. for the class placement exam. He opened his bag, knowing the entrance ceremony was over but also knowing the real challenge lay in the placement exam. Looking at his sashimi knife, he reminded himself that an exam is still an exam, and he'll need to familiarize himself with it. He realized he hadn't used a knife since arriving in this world because he hadn't needed to. Memories of his master came flooding back, reminding him that even for a single day, one must never put down their knife. His master had even told him to hold it while sleeping. Geomat chuckled, thinking he had absorbed another one of his master's habits. But he also wondered if a year's break from wielding the blade had dulled his skills, despite living by the knife for 20 years. He then unsheathed the knife slightly, feeling its edge. A small smile appeared on his face as he realized the blade was in better condition than he had expected. Deciding to test it, he fully removed the cover, planning to cut a few practice strokes. But as soon as the cover came off completely, powerful energy surged from his hand and flowed through the entire sashimi knife. The system notification flashed before him, the weapon meets activation conditions. The blessing of the sword god is activated. But just as he processed that, another message appeared, the level of the physical body and weapon is too low. Suppression was activated to initiate synchronization. In shock and disbelief, he could barely think. All he had done was draw the knife, and yet the blessing of the sword god had already activated. The system displayed a message, synchronization is complete. May the blessing of the gods be with you. Suddenly, he felt an unbearable surge of power and screamed in agony as the blessing of the sword god activated within him. The energy crawled through his body, causing excruciating pain. He knew that if it continued, he would die, but the power didn't stop. All he could do was endure. Suddenly, a bright, powerful light exploded in front of him. When he opened his eyes, the school around him had shattered like glass. Stunned, he stood in shock, wondering what the hell was happening. His grip on the knife loosened, and as soon as it hit the ground, the shattered world restored itself, leaving him even more surprised. He realized that the moment he let go of the knife, everything returned to normal. Suddenly, his head and body throbbed with pain. He understood that the divine power had activated, but he wondered if the world-breaking effect had something to do with the sword god's blessing. The backlash from the activation was immense, and he knew that his divine power of painlessness could only help with mild muscle soreness, not this kind of overwhelming pain. He looked at his shaking hand, realizing that if every activation felt like this, the power was unusable. An announcement rang out, instructing students to gather at the training hall immediately. He debated whether he should pick the knife back up. He couldn't just leave a sashimi knife lying on the ground, and he tried to comfort himself by thinking maybe it only hurt during the first activation. Nervously, he reached for the knife, wondering if he'd be okay. The moment he touched it, he screamed again as the power surged through him, and in agony, he shouted, "What the fuck is this?" Meanwhile, in the training hall, students were gathering, and the professors were mingling, laughing, and discussing how much they had spent on their children's admission. One of the professors noticed a figure and commented to another, "Look, Clinch has made quite the journey." The 7-star hero Siegfried von Nibelung was standing nearby. The others greeted him, recognizing him as a descendant of Aaron Nibelung and the direct disciple of the founding hero, Valor Jacquin. Siegfried, however, remained silent, staring at them, which made the professors feel awkward as they returned to their seats. Siegfried sighed and glanced beside him as someone approached, the 7-star hero sage, Media Poison. She greeted him, saying it had been a while, and asked if it had really been half a century. He replied that he could see she still hadn't started dressing like an academy director and joked that turning 70 hadn't changed her much. She teased back, saying every woman wants to remain beautiful until they die, and offered to make him look 10 years younger with her blessing. He dismissed her offer, remarking that despite her upcoming 70th birthday, she still hadn't grown up, and humans should value their inner nature. Playfully, she called him an old fart and pointed out how he hadn't changed in 50 years, which annoyed him, prompting him to call her an old hag. Smiling, she teased that he had changed a lot if he was willing to attend events like these, and he grumbled that he used to hate even breathing the same air as the egoistic bastards present. She guessed his granddaughter must be quite pretty to have made him attend. Siegfried stayed quiet and mentioned that it looked like things were about to start. Meanwhile, in the center of the training hall, students were chatting and introducing themselves. Gio mastered silently, observing them. He wondered if he was the only one with black hair and if he was the only special admission student among the nobles. He remembered the students from the equipment inspection and how they had glared at him with disdain. The memory made him feel lowly and out of place. Suddenly, everyone's attention shifted to someone entering the hall. A bright, radiant presence moved through the crowd, and Gio Ma's eyes widened in shock as he saw who it was. Every man she passed seemed entranced by her, but Gio Ma knew better. She was Abel von Nibelung, the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor and the main heroine of the game, the very reason he had spent a fortune on it. Subspace, created by the ancestral hero Baylor Joaquin, was a dimension formed alongside the establishment of the Academy. It was a reality separate from their own, where the rules of the real world did not apply. Even murder was overlooked. Siegfried asked the media if the theme for the event was a subspace battle royale. She confirmed, explaining that subspace battles were a tradition at their school. However, this year they were trying something different with a battle royale format, where participants would be split into groups of 10. Siegfried remarked that it meant it was a survival game. Media responded that there were no restrictions on equipment, to which Siegfried commented that it would just be a free-for-all for the privileged types with access to better gear. Media quickly told him not to bring it up, explaining that she had compromised as much as she could. She also added that, whether he liked it or not, the academy was mostly funded by nobility, and she had gone through a lot of trouble just to introduce the new system. Giamat's attention shifted to Abel, noticing how unnervingly beautiful she was. He thought of her as a character out of a 2D game but realized it was something more. He mused that the men who tried to approach her were fools. Had he not known better, he might have done the same. Having played the game to some extent, he knew Abel was a player with the miracle blessing M, meaning she was tied to the game's protagonist. He reflected that beautiful people always hit someone by their side, and someone like him, a special student, was not on their level. He preferred avoiding involvement to prevent a noisy school life. As he pulled out his book, he recalled the 3 principles he had set for his future: complete his studies without incident, secure a conventional job, and live a safe life. The book mentioned that the most coveted occupation was hero, offering an extremely high salary, which made him wonder what kind of hardships came with it. Remembering how even the sight of a knife made him tremble, he closed the book, thinking that heroes should protect the world while he found a more comfortable job. An announcement suddenly echoed, informing students that the class assignment exam for the 783rd year at Hoken Academy was starting. It explained that this year's exam, as previously announced, would be a battle royale. Among the 10 randomly assigned cadets, the first-place winner would be assigned to the Star class, second and third places to the Dragon class, and 8th to 10th places to the Ordinary class. The class assignments would be based on these results. Scores would be automatically assigned, and there was no time limit. Geoman noticed it was just like the game, and his goal was to secure a spot in the Ordinary class, so he planned to finish quickly. The subspace generation device activated, consuming everyone as they entered the subspace. The exam began, with the system wishing them the blessings of the heroes. Geoman resolved to avoid using his knife if possible. A short while later, students were being evaluated by the system as they exited subspace, securing their class rankings. Meanwhile, others were still fighting inside. Media told Siegfried that, because of his granddaughter's bloodline from Qinqiang and Jialgon, her results would be significant. Siegfried simply asked why she was bringing it up now. Media pointed out an impressive time of 7 minutes and 14 seconds achieved with a C-rank weapon. Siegfried noted that Abel sought a fair assessment. Media responded that Abel, although a stickler for fairness, still ranked among the top 10 in the Academy's history. Siegfried proudly stated that this was only natural, given the bloodline of Nibelung, and stood up, announcing it seemed to be wrapping up, so he was leaving. Media informed him there was still one group left, but Siegfried dismissed them as offspring of the pigs and walked away, saying he would see her next time. Media cryptically replied that she would see him in the afterlife. Suddenly, a powerful sensation stopped both of them in their tracks, and everyone felt it. Media asked Siegfried if he sensed it too, and he replied that it was unbelievable. He scanned the stage and the surroundings, noting there wasn't a place in the entire building where that sensation wasn't felt. Then, once again, they experienced a surge of immense power and saw the subspace above them tear open. Both stood in shock as they witnessed the subspace shattering into pieces. 2 students were thrown from it, leaving the crowd stunned. The students crashed onto the stage, shattering the ground on impact. No one could believe that people had fallen out of subspace. Then, a brilliant light appeared above them once more, prompting Siegfried to look up in concern. Something fell from the subspace and pierced the ground near one of the collapsed students. The media quickly called for the medical staff to check the vitals of the cadets who had emerged. Meanwhile, the sashimi knife near Guillaume's head shined brightly. Before the confrontation, he was facing his teammate, muttering bastard, thinking that the results were inevitable and predetermined. However, just as the thought crossed his mind, their enemy grabbed his teammate and slammed him into the wall, shattering it to pieces. He stared at his squad, realizing, unfortunately, that he had been caught in the squad of death. He knew their enemies were the infamous twins of malevolence from the Iron King family, Mao Jun and Mao Shun. Though they possessed innate talent, their brutality and deceit knew no bounds. He was furious that these bastards had been toying with them for 30 minutes, and he wondered if he appeared so weak that he wasn't even worth their attention. Shun glanced at the man in his grasp, realizing he was dead, and tossed the body aside, bored. He began counting the students he had killed, asking Jun how many were left. As Jun stepped on a student's neck, Shun noted the student was still alive, but Jun simply crushed him to death, replying that it was more or less over. Shun, annoyed, reminded Jun that he had caught 4 of them. Jun apologized, pointing to the side and telling Shun he could have that one. Shun turned to look at the trembling girl and agreed, saying he would accept it. He, watching in disbelief, noticed that the girl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, seemed to be in a panic, her will to fight entirely gone. As Shun approached the girl, he teasingly told his brother Jun to look at her, commenting that she was to his taste and expressing curiosity about the sound of her screams. Shun excitedly shouted that he was dying to find out, while the girl remained frozen in fear. Jun, half-jokingly, told Shun that even though he was his little brother, he was such a pervert. Shun then scares the girl, asking where he should start tearing her apart. It was at that moment that he shouted at the twins, calling them bastards to get their attention. He demanded to know why they were going so far, even in subspace, and asked if they were psychopaths. But then he realized, too late, that he had stepped forward without thinking. Shun, amused, asked Jun if there was one more student left. Jun pointed out Jiam's name tag and remarked that he was a special student, which, to them, was a lowly bastard. The brothers turned to stare at him, smiling creepily. Shun, still grinning, told Jun he would take care of him quickly. Jun agreed, reminding Shun to rip out his tongue since he had insulted them. Shun, still laughing, said he would, walking closer to him. Panicking, he frantically considered what to do. He wondered if he should use the blessing of painlessness, but then realized that since the twins had been desecrating corpses for 30 minutes, avoiding pain for just 30 seconds wouldn't help. Suddenly, a bright light shone from his bag, surprising him. He remembered the sashimi knife he had inside, but he knew that holding the sword would activate the blessing of the sword gone. He hadn't even made it half a day since deciding to live an ordinary, uneventful, and safe life. Shun noticed him reaching into his bag and mockingly asked what it was. When he pulled out the sashimi knife, the twins were stunned for a moment before bursting into laughter. They couldn't believe it and taunted him, asking if it was a joke. The girl, watching in terror, stood frozen in fear. Shun adjusted his stance, shouting that since he was at least a little amusing, he would make his death as painless as possible. He then leapt into the air, appearing above him, shouting that he would smash his head first. Realizing he couldn't be picky, he opened his legs wide and hoped for the best. He activated the blessing of painlessness for 30 seconds, along with the blessing of the sword gone, while removing the knife's cover. He knew that painlessness would counteract the pain caused by the blessing of the sword gone for 30 seconds. As Shun launched his robotic hand towards him, tauntingly asking what he could possibly do with a pathetic knife like that. He knew that if he couldn't cut, he would die. He worried about the sashimi knife's ability to cut through Shun's heavy equipment, thinking that Shun wasn't a fish but a person. He remembered once asking his master why gangsters in movies wielded sashimi knives, wondering if they really used them to cut people and not just fish. His master had called him a crazy bastard, telling him it was only in movies and that even a god couldn't make it work. But he added that if he slashed it right, it would still cut. As the power of the sword god surged through his body, a strong, bright light was released. He swung the knife, slashing at Shun's arm just as Shun yelled at him to get lost. Shun was shocked to see his arm severed, and it fell, slamming to the ground in front of Jioma. Back when he was still on Earth, he once called his boss to ask about gangsters. In the middle of the call, a sharp object was suddenly thrown at him. He shook in fear as he realized it was a knife now lodged in the wall behind him. The man reminded him to call him master and asked why he was curious about such things. He knew that his first master had been a former thug. As atonement, the man had cut off one of his own wrists and later opened a sashimi restaurant, saying he wanted to bring happiness to people through his knife skills, and his master's skills were indeed impressive. Curious, he asked his master why gangsters in movies always wield sashimi knives. He wondered if it was like that in real life too. His master replied sharply, telling him that someone with experience in knife skills shouldn't be asking such questions. He explained that if someone stabbed a person with a wide chef's knife, the skin would immediately contract. His master then asked if he thought it would even come out easily. He explained that a sashimi knife, being narrow, could stab multiple times and be withdrawn effortlessly. When he asked why they didn't just slice since they could slice fish, his master yelled that fish could be sliced because they lay down still. If they were standing, he wouldn't even be able to slice bread in one go. He then mentioned that in manga, it always looked like a clean slice. His master hit him on the back, reminding him to call him master, not boss, and told him that even if the god of knives were involved, it wouldn't work that way. But in his current situation, as he sliced Shun's arm with the sashimi knife, it worked perfectly. Shun was in shock, staring at his falling arm alongside his brother Young, while the girl looked on in stunned disbelief. When Shun's arm hit the ground, the pain hit him all at once, and he screamed in agony. Shun cried out for his lost arm, pleading for help as he saw his opponent approaching him. Stammering, Shun shouted at him to stay away, but he continued to advance. Shun, now in terror, turned and ran, screaming for someone to help him. Young, frozen in horror, watched as his younger brother tried to flee. When Shun neared his brother, Jioma moved swiftly, slicing Shun's head cleanly in half with terrifying ease. Young, paralyzed by the sight, stared in disbelief at his brother's severed head. He screamed out Shun's name, filled with both rage and sorrow. Meanwhile, Jioma stood silently, and the girl continued to watch, wide-eyed and shocked. Young reminded himself that this was subspace and that Shun wasn't really dead. He tried to calm down, thinking that his brother's death didn't matter here. But as he stared at Shun's lifeless body, he noticed something odd. His opponent seemed like someone who had just used a knife on a person for the first time. He also noticed the man's ragged breath and trembling, wondering if the events were just a coincidence. Regardless, Young realized he needed to watch out for that knife. Grabbing Shun's hand equipment, Young thought his brother's downfall had been due to carelessness. He put the equipment on his own arm and shouted that the weapons were at their best when used with both hands. Young then activated the Blessing of Resolution, which amplified his defense, the Blessing of Intervention, which increased his jump power by 200%, and the Blessing of Spirit, which significantly boosted the power of his punches. Confidently, Young yelled that those were rank blessings that commoners could only dream of. He taunted Jioma, saying that even an S-rank weapon wouldn't be able to pierce his armor and that he wasn't like his little brother, Shun. Meanwhile, Jioma was enduring the pain, quietly counting down from 23. Young launched himself forward, shouting that he had been standing there dumbfounded the whole time. He asked mockingly if Jioma was mumbling his last words. Laughing, Young declared he would smash his head in, but Jioma didn't even flinch. When there were only 6 seconds left in his countdown, Young was suddenly cut to pieces, stabbed repeatedly with the sashimi knife. Young shook in agony, slowly dying. Jioma remained in the same position, still counting down. At the final second, just as Young died, he wondered in his last moments what kind of being his opponent was. As the countdown reached 0, the system notified him that the effect of the blessing of painlessness had ended. He screamed in pain, clutching the sashimi knife. Later, he opened his eyes and saw that he was in a room. He asked himself if it was a hospital and sat up, feeling pain coursing through his body. Just then, a man entered the room. Upon seeing him awake, the man immediately stepped out, reporting that he had regained consciousness. This surprised him. Soon after, several people entered the room, and he was stunned. These were faces he had never seen in person before but somehow recognized. He remembered, 50 years ago, that these were the same people who defeated the Demon Lord's 6th Legion commander. They were the 7-star heroes, the strongest of mankind, Siegfried, and the Academy's head sage, Media Poison. He wondered why on earth they were here. Siegfried was the first to speak, asking him for his name. He replied, Kong Jioma. But Siegfried, with a serious expression, quickly cut to the point, asking him, what on earth did you do? Kong Jioma hesitated, knowing that the sensation he had felt during the battle wasn't just in his imagination, it was real. He looked at Siegfried and noticed he was holding a sword. Realizing the gravity of being noticed by such a monstrous figure, Jioma responded that even if it was a pocket dimension, he judged that the twins' actions went too far. Still, and he thinks his response was excessive, so he'll accept any punishment without complaint. He then stared back at Siegfried, who was still fixated on him. The media broke the silence, calling Siegfried an old fool and asking him how he planned to handle a young one. She leaned in closer to Jioma, adding that even though Siegfried spoke harshly, it was he who had cleared his blocked blood vessels while he was unconscious. With a playful tone, she commented that they say people only get more stubborn with age and sweetly asked him to give her a break for the sake of her face. Siegfried, clearly flustered, shouted at Media, reminding her not to mention it. Media hugged him, teasing, the old fool is embarrassed, leaving Jioma wondering why Siegfried had done such a thing for him. It dawned on him why his body felt so light, or perhaps, as damp as a wet feather. Media, meanwhile, gazed happily at his shoulders. With a gleam of excitement, Media explained that while he was unconscious, they extracted the footage of what happened and watched it with the staff. The sight of him throwing himself to protect that poor female student, and he were literally the prince she dreamed of. She then playfully added, he was the prince himself, before Siegfried interrupted her, making her irritated. He insisted she show some dignity, though Media didn't seem too bothered. She went on to explain that she's not saying they'll make an issue out of his actions during the exam, so he shouldn't need to worry. And honestly, those twins from the Mao family only got into the academy by buttering up the elders, but they've said they'll withdraw on their own. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, realizing he wouldn't have to deal with them at school anymore. The media then told him that they had come to deliver some news. He asked what it was, and media smiled, replying that he was the top scorer and congratulating him. Jeoma blinked in disbelief, asking what they meant by that. He couldn't believe it. His vision of a safe, sound, and secure future was fading away before his eyes. A moment later, in Media's office, she told Siegfried that in her nearly 20 years as head of the academy, it was the first time something like this had ever happened. She recalled Jeoma's response when he said he didn't like being the top scorer, which shocked both of them. She asked if he understood what it meant to be in the star class, reminding him that while the elders were furious, the top cadet's decision was based on a result directly graded by the space itself. He thought for a moment but still replied that he didn't like it, prompting her to ask again if he truly didn't understand. Siegfried meanwhile silently observed the exchange. Siegfried snapped back to attention when Media addressed him directly, asking if he was upset that Jeoma took the top spot instead of his granddaughter. She reminded him that he had seen the footage himself. He replied that it was foolish to question the judgment of the subspace, which was imbued with the will of the founding hero. The academy had chosen Jeoma as the top cadet, and they should simply follow that decision. Siegfried reflected that if Jeoma's skills had been outstanding, he would have understood. If Jeoma's physical abilities were exceptional, he would have accepted it. And if his experience had been remarkable, he would have agreed. But what he saw in this young boy, who had barely reached adulthood, was something more. His movements embodied a concept, a swordsmanship that Siegfried had pursued his entire life, a level of mastery. Yet the unsettling feeling he had when he unblocked Jeoma's meridians lingered. Jeoma's body, soft and unconditioned as though it had never undergone training, seemed to contain something that shouldn't have been there. Siegfried sighed, realizing that even at his age, he couldn't believe he still had such a competitive spirit, especially toward a boy the same age as his granddaughter. Siegfried was startled again when he heard media praising Jeoma's delicate features and the way he heroically cut down enemies to save a woman in distress. She added that if she were just 10 years younger, or even now, she wondered if she could still try to win him over. She asked Siegfried what he thought, but he simply responded by asking if she knew what college cadets call girls like her these days. Intrigued, the media urged him to continue, daring him to open his big mouth. When she asked him again what they called someone like her, he set down his coffee cup, making her even more excited. Calmly, he told her, "They call you a beach." Media, enraged, stood up and attacked Siegfried, shaking the entire room. The next day, Jeoma arrived at his wolf class. He knew it was the best compromise he could have made. He remembered how media had ordered someone to send him to the upper class, but he insisted on joining the tiger class. The media had shouted that the top cadet couldn't be sent to the tiger class, but he had argued back, questioning why not when the academy prided itself on equality. Media had responded that, despite that, the tiger class was off limits, and instead, she promised to keep his request a secret, knowing that if the elders found out, they would cause an even bigger fuss. Jeoma sighed as he opened the classroom door, frustrated because his plan had been to quietly complete his studies in a lower class without getting caught up in the power struggles of the upper ranks. At least this arrangement was still within his expectations. As he entered, the door suddenly slammed shut, causing a loud noise. He looked around and noticed his classmates staring at him. They stared for a moment, but when they saw the color of his name tag, they quickly averted their gaze and returned to their usual activities. As he walked to his seat, he thought to himself that they should keep ignoring him, just as he preferred. When he finally sat down, he was amazed that everyone was completely ignoring him. He figured that Headmaster Media had managed to keep things under wraps. Feeling relieved, he happily pulled out his book, thinking that being a loner had its perks. Maybe this was a good thing. But just as he began to settle in, he heard someone approaching. When he looked at his side, he saw the girl from the subspace exam. She thanked him for what he did back then. He stared at her silently for a moment, realizing he didn't remember her. She quickly reminded him that she was the girl from the exam. He found it odd that she was using such formal language when they were the same age and replied that there was no need to thank him, as anyone would have done the same in that situation. Although it seemed like he had saved her, he knew deep down he was only trying to survive and felt hypocritical. He then mentioned that they hadn't properly introduced themselves, introducing himself as Kong Jeoma. She responded that her name was Chloe. He said it was nice to meet her, still surprised they ended up in the same class. She greeted him in return while he quietly wondered who she really was. He had played through most of the game's story, but he didn't recognize her name. As far as he knew, the later stages of the game focused on the battle against the demon tribe, so it was unexpected to meet a new character now. Then he realized that Chloe might just be a background character like him. Jeoma asked if she could keep what happened during the exam secret, to which she immediately agreed. She seemed about to say something else when a teacher entered, loudly instructing everyone to take their seats. Jeoma told Chloe they could talk later, and she nodded in agreement. The teacher congratulated them on their admission and told them they should be proud, as they were all chosen to carry on the will of the founding hero, Valor Jokwin. He introduced himself as Lee Wonbin, the chief instructor of the wolf class. Lee explained that since it was their first day, they would start with some basic physical training and instructed them to change into their training clothes and gather at the training ground in 30 minutes. When one student asked what the training would be, Lee replied it was simple: 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, followed by 10 laps around the training ground. He then shouted for everyone to change and gather, to which they all responded with a resounding yes. As the students began to file out of the room, Jeoma stayed seated, wondering if the training was designed to turn cadets into bald-headed soldiers. He approached Lee, who asked what was on his mind. Jeoma, hoping to find a way out of the tedious training, replied that he was feeling a bit sick. Lee thought for a moment before telling him that, as the top cadet, the basic training wouldn't be very useful for him. He suggested that Jeoma attend star class training on his first day, mentioning that the headmaster had granted him permission to attend all classes. Shocked, Jeoma thought to himself, "Media, you damn old hag." Laughing it off, Jeoma quickly said that he just needed to use the restroom urgently and was only feeling a bit sore. Lee chuckled and replied that he appreciated Jeoma's straightforwardness, saying he would see him at the training ground, to which Jeoma replied, yes. Later, as Jeoma ran around the training ground, he was utterly exhausted. Lee shouted at the group that this was just light work and that they should move faster. But Jeoma found himself falling behind, feeling like he was dying. Just then, Chloe appeared beside him, asking if the training was too difficult since he looked unwell. He laughed weakly, replying that he was fine. She asked what lap he was on, and he guessed it was his 5th. Surprised, he asked her what lap she was on, as she seemed to be running behind as well. To his shock, she replied that she was on her 9th lap. She then encouraged him to keep going, shouting that he could do it, before speeding off, leaving Jeoma suffering and exhausted. Days later, in Jeoma's dorm room, empty water bottles littered the floor and surfaces. He slammed another one down on the table and cursed, he was starving. A week into academy life, he had encountered an unexpected problem. At the cafeteria, he had rushed to the counter, shouting that he was hungry and ordering a pork belly rice bowl in a hurry. However, the cafeteria lady stared at the meal ticket box next to him. That's when he realized the food wasn't free. Embarrassed, he told her he'd get the ticket right away and asked if she could prepare the meal in advance. But he froze when he saw the price of 50,000 won for a pork belly rice bowl. The other items on the menu ranged from 25,000 won to 150,000 won. He stood in horror, unable to believe the prices. Back in his dorm, he drank the last drop from his water bottle and angrily tossed it aside. He thought $50,000 for a pork belly rice bowl was outrageous. His living expenses were nearly gone, and he remembered refusing pocket money from his father. Staring at the empty bottles on the floor, he rolled onto his bed, cursing himself for not accepting the money when he had the chance. For days, he'd been surviving on the cheapest water from the campus store. Suddenly, a system notification appeared, showing his physical state had increased to 12. As his physical condition improved, the sword specifications relaxed, activating a blessing for swords 32 centimeters or shorter and 6 centimeters or less in width. Smiling, he stood up and looked at himself in the mirror, admiring his abs and thinking the effort hadn't been wasted. He wondered if the blessing of the sword god had cleared his blood vessels, feeling as if he were evolving. Despite his progress, he knew the blessing hadn't fully expanded. If he continued improving step by step, he might be able to handle a short sword soon. Staring at the sashimi knives on his counter, he recalled how terrified he had been of holding a blade during the entrance ceremony. Now, if he wasn't holding a knife, his hands itched, making him wonder if this was the blessing's influence. Scratching his head, he asked himself why he felt so proud. Just then, someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, he found Chloe standing there. She asked if she had disturbed his rest, to which he replied no, as he was just lying down. He asked what was going on. She explained that she hadn't seen him in the cafeteria all week and was worried he might not be feeling well. He awkwardly replied that he usually didn't eat food made by others, although in truth, he loved food made by others and was starving. She nodded, understanding, and told him not to worry. Then she suggested that if he was up for it, they could buy ingredients from the campus store and make dinner together. Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and told her they should go, leaving her confused. He asked if she was inviting him to dinner, and she confirmed, a bit surprised. He happily led the way, telling her that he was good at cooking and would handle it. He asked if her dorm was across the way, to which she replied yes, still chasing after him as he walked with excitement. Later, in Chloe's dorm, she exclaimed how delicious the food was. Jeoma smiled and said he was glad she liked it. She complimented him on how quickly and skillfully he had prepared the meal, admitting she had only ever boiled fish and never thought she'd get to taste cooking like that. He quietly stared at the empty plates, pleased. Earlier, he had asked if he could check her fridge, and she had agreed. When he opened it, he noticed it was full of fish. She explained she was from a seaside area, which made sense to him. He smiled, realizing he was itching to cook again. Deciding to treat himself, he thought about slicing some sashimi but hesitated due to the sword god's blessing. Laying the kitchen knives on the counter, he asked if she had a longer knife. Chloe was confused, but when he explained that his weapon was similar to those kinds of swords, she understood. She handed him a knife and asked if it would work, but he decided to stick with the kitchen knife. Grabbing the knife, he decided to finish in 30 seconds. Activating the blessing of painlessness, he focused on the sashimi, remembering that he had once been the best swordsman in the country. He activated the sword, God's blessing, and sliced through the fish, finishing in 21 seconds. In that time, he scaled the fish, split the bones, removed the entrails, and filled the flesh. The result was so perfect it felt like a masterpiece, and he was proud to still have his skills. Chloe asked how he was so good at cooking, and he replied that he used to work part-time at a Japanese restaurant. She then asked what a part-time job was, surprising him. He asked if she didn't know what it was, and she apologized. He told her there was no need to apologize, attributing the confusion to their difference in status. Changing the subject, he told her he was glad she enjoyed the meal, and she nodded happily, offering to wash up since he had cooked. He thanked her and left her to it. As she rushed to the sink, he walked to the window and stared at the moon, feeling full and satisfied, humming a tune to himself. However, he was interrupted by the sound of plates falling, followed by Chloe's repeated apologies. He wondered if she had ever done the dishes before, thinking back to when he was her age and doing the same chores. Suddenly, a note fell onto the table, flipping open when it landed. Surprised, he realized it was Chloe's diary. The round handwriting and cute stickers made him think she was just like any other girl her age. He intended to put it back, but the air flipped it open, revealing an entry. He read that the person who saved her during the exam turned out to be in her class, and his name was Jioma. The entry said her heart raced whenever she saw him, and she didn't know how to approach him. He smiled, thinking it was cute, realizing that this was why she hadn't been able to talk to him before. Curious, he flipped through a few more pages. His eyes widened in shock when he saw a page written repeatedly, "I love him." At that moment, a loud crash came from the sink. He turned to see Chloe standing there, terrified. She asked him in a trembling voice if he had seen her diary. Heroic families gain honor by slaying monsters, receiving society's admiration and solidifying their positions. Yet, within these stagnant institutions, vested interests often exploit the weak under the guise of authority. When public authorities fail to condemn such exploitation, one heroic family steps into the shadows, the Auditor de Cecilia family. This family operates covertly, aiming for justice while combining order maintenance with assassination. Those born into the Auditor family undergo mental conditioning before puberty, suppressing their emotions and enduring grueling training to become assassins. Chloe was only 15 when she first killed. She had been startled to see a man tied to a pole, but the old man at her side forced her forward, placing a sword in her hand and making her deliver the fatal blow. Afterward, he reminded her not to deny her talents as an assassin. These were words she had heard repeatedly, even before adulthood. The constant training warped her mind, casting a deep shadow over her heart. By the time her sense of self had been worn away, leaving only fragments of emotion, Chloe was ready to enroll at the Jokwin Academy. At the academy, where students were assigned to classes based on individual skill, members of the Auditor family, despite their exceptional abilities, were always placed in the common class due to a long-standing tradition and an agreement with the academy. Although the Auditor family operated in the shadows, their skills far surpassed those of the Dragon class. Chloe's grandfather had ordered her to remain unnoticed. The family's strict control took away her personal freedom, forcing her to follow the path of an assassin. She obeyed without a word, believing that nothing would change no matter what she did. At least, that's what she thought until she met Jioma. During the subspace battle royale, Chloe encountered death for the first time, though it wasn't real in that space. Despite the gravity of the situation, she wasn't afraid. Having long accepted her fate, she faced death calmly, no longer struggling against it. But something shifted when she saw Jioma fight. It was as if a storm had parted, letting sunlight break through. For the first time, she felt the desire to wield her sword for someone else, not just out of duty. It was Jioma's will that stirred something warm within her. She recalled a childhood memory, a fairy tale she had secretly kept hidden by her bedside. It was about a prince rescuing a princess from a castle. Her face flushed as she realized the connection, an unfamiliar feeling filling her chest, love. In the present, Jioma found himself cursing under his breath, watching as Chloe seemed lost in thought. He laughed awkwardly, trying to ease the tension, but her silence and unblinking stare only made him feel more uncomfortable. He realized something had gone wrong, wondering if it had been when he first saw her vulnerability or when he foolishly joined her for dinner. Trying to salvage the situation, Jioma made a polite comment about the evening, hoping to lighten the mood, but she remained fixated on him. He thanked her for the dinner, preparing to leave, but her gaze lingered on him, and she asked if he had seen it. Confused, Jioma asked what she meant. Chloe removed her gloves, and her attention shifted to the diary on the table. Realization hit him, she was referring to her diary. He attempted to downplay the situation, suggesting that she must have worked hard on her studies, but she corrected him, making it clear she was talking about her personal diary. He felt a surge of unease. How had she known he had seen it? He wondered if she had somehow seen him reading it without him noticing. Then something else struck him. Chloe was using formal language again. Despite his earlier insistence that she didn't need to, she suddenly seemed like a completely different person. He quickly denied seeing anything, but Chloe asked him again if he was sure. He repeated his denial, but she pressed him not to lie. Realizing there was no point in denying it further, he admitted that he had seen it. For a moment, she simply stared at him, and then, to his shock, she slowly drew her katana from its sheath. Horror surged through him as he glanced down at the edge of the roof. They were on the 4th floor, and if he jumped, he knew he'd be smashed to pieces. Looking around, he realized there was only one exit, the door next to Chloe. He was trapped. A loud scraping sound broke the tension, and when he peeked over his shoulder, his blood ran cold. Chloe was dragging her katana along the floor, walking slowly toward him like a puppet. Her movements were devoid of emotion. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was she even aware of what she was doing? Her pupils were still, and her red eyes looked lifeless. That's when it hit him. She had all the signs of a yandere. He recalled her energetic personality, so full of life that it could change in an instant. Was this a split personality? The realization that she might be a yandere with a split personality was terrifying enough, but the fact that he had triggered this shift by opening her diary made it worse. He knew the situation was dangerous. She would likely chase him until she succeeded in killing him, so he had to find a way to escape and ensure his survival. He could sense that Chloe's killing intent was even stronger than the Mao brothers, making him curse under his breath. Academy life was turning out to be far more dangerous than he'd expected. He needed to get out of this situation first. His thoughts raced, and then he remembered that he still had 9 seconds left on his painless blessing. However, his sashimi knife was back in his room, and the knife he had used earlier was too far away. If he tried to reach for it, he was certain he'd lose an arm, or worse. Suddenly, Chloe raised her katana, and in a panic, he stepped back, hitting the table behind him. His eyes fell on a small cutter lying there. She leaped at him, swinging her katana with deadly precision. Desperate, he grabbed the cutter, knowing full well that talking his way out of this was unlikely to work. As he prepared to defend himself, a system notification appeared, showing that his mental state had risen. Along with this, his ingenuity increased, and words and actions became temporarily imbued with an aura of intimidation. The restraining power adjusted to fit him, and the divine protection of the sword god was activated. As they met in the middle, he tried a different approach, commenting on her hair, saying it was slightly too long and that he would trim it a bit. In that moment, they both released their slashes simultaneously. Later, Chloe woke up in her bed, searching for Jioma. Looking around her room, she remembered him standing by the window while she was doing the dishes. She had been sneaking glances at him. Panic set in when she suddenly recalled her katana, but seeing it resting safely next to her study table, she sighed in relief. She often lost consciousness when handling the katana, a side effect of her conditioning. Her thoughts drifted to the old man, who had always praised her for her talent as an assassin, telling her not to worry after each kill and reminding her to never deny her abilities. Frustrated, she slammed her face into her pillow, calling herself a fool for fainting. Embarrassed, she thought about Jioma, wondering if she had said anything strange when she lost consciousness. Then, her eyes fell on the cutter lying on the floor. Confused, she held her hair up to her face and realized it had been cut shorter. Glancing at the trash bin, she saw the cut strands of hair and guessed that Jioma must have cleaned up before leaving. Blushing, she thought to herself how kind Jioma was and hurried to grab her diary, eager to write down her thoughts before she forgot. As she scribbled, her entry focused on how much she admired him. Meanwhile, Jioma was outside the dorm, struggling and vomiting by the side of the path. He was relieved to have survived the situation with Chloe but knew he had pushed his blessing too far, going 5 seconds over the 9-second limit, which left him physically ill. He tried to suppress the nausea, but it was no use. He ended up throwing up everything he had eaten for dinner. Sitting on a nearby bench, he felt the hunger return, his entire meal now gone. As he stared at the moon, Jioma reflected on Chloe and her abilities. Normally, swordsmanship is about striking decisively to end a fight, but the way Chloe fought was different. Her blade relentlessly targeted vital points, almost as if it were designed for ambush tactics. He realized that had she ambushed him, his head would have been taken off without a doubt. Feeling threatened, he had instinctively aimed for her nape during their encounter. Thankfully, the cutter he wielded was short, so he only managed to cut her hair. He sighed, relieved that he had cleaned up the situation quickly and that there shouldn't be any further complications. Though he admitted to himself that finding stability, safety, and security in this world was proving far more difficult than he anticipated. He reflected on how much harder it was to simply lead an ordinary life. When he was first thrown into this strange, shameless game-like world, he hadn't lacked ambition. For someone who had once reigned at the pinnacle with nothing more than a sashimi knife, giving up on the romantic idea of living as a man had been a tough choice, but he knew that everyone had their assigned role. He then thought about the game he was now living in. The blessing of miracles was the unique blessing of the game's protagonist, who Jiome had yet to encounter. Alongside it was the blessing of valor from Valor Hoken. He remembered that these were the only two legendary blessings in the game, and their contents were intuitive. The protagonist wielded both the holy sword and the demon sword, Bamung. In contrast, Gyomei could only use sashimi knives, a fact that made him wonder if any further explanation of his fate was even necessary. Slapping his face to refocus, Gyomei reminded himself of his goal. Since entering the academy, the constant encounters with unrealistic characters and bizarre situations had distracted him from what he came to achieve. He realized that he had been sidetracked by various events and began to wonder if there was anyone ordinary in this world at all. Despite having a vague understanding of the key characters in the game, Gyomei still felt his knowledge of this world was lacking. After all, it had only been a little over a week since he entered the academy. According to the game's story, the main character's blessing was due to activate soon. With the enrollment process almost complete, Gyomei knew the real story was finally about to begin. Gyomei knew the general plot of the game, but having never seen the ending gave him an advantage, at least up to the midpoint. He decided that no matter what happened, he should stick to the official route. If things strayed too far off course, it would waste whatever benefits he might gain from his knowledge. He recalled that the story took a much darker turn in the second semester of the third year, when the birth of a hero would cause the demon race to unite under their demon lords and threaten the academy. This would lead to a full-scale war between demons and humanity. He remembered the game's typical glitch/U00E9 fantasy plot, and, as someone who had once sought a charming, youthful life he never got to experience, he had deleted the game halfway through. Now, though, the realization that this terrible war was real chilled him, making him wonder if he, too, was doomed to die in it. But he shook off those thoughts, deciding that with nearly 3 years left, he needed a more realistic goal than mere escapism. He couldn't allow himself to die quietly in this world. He needed to get stronger and survive. Most mass-produced games like this one tended to have happy endings, and he guessed that the protagonist would save the world. But he couldn't rely on that alone. He needed power to protect himself. He couldn't live with the constant fear of dying in a war caught up in events beyond his control. That meant training, but he would have to do it without drawing too much attention. If he stood out, he risked being conscripted to fight against the demon army, something he needed to avoid at all costs. He also reminded himself to be cautious with the blessing of painlessness. Though he picked up the sashimi knife out of necessity, the strain on his body from using the blessing was too great. A system notification appeared, showing his blessing stats, and though the performance looked impressive, there was a lot of new information he wasn't sure how to interpret. He focused on the stats, noting that his physical, mental, and weapon ranks seemed to represent his levels of growth. His eyes landed on the assimilation rate, but when he tried to check what it meant, the system blocked his access, telling him that conditions had not yet been met. It didn't seem important for now. What mattered most was his physical training. He needed a new weapon. Relying solely on the blessing of painlessness for 30 seconds wouldn't work forever, and he also needed to train with swords that didn't meet the conditions for the sword god's blessing. Next month's practical combat training would replace the midterm exams, and the reward for excelling was the Murasama, a B-rank sword. Gyomei knew that if he could handle it skillfully, it would be enough to carry him through graduation. Its specifications didn't meet the activation conditions for the sword god's blessing, so it wouldn't put as much strain on him as his primary weapon. Realizing he had more to do than he thought, Gyomei was suddenly interrupted by someone calling his name. When he turned, he saw Abel standing nearby, telling him that he was sitting in her spot. He froze in shock, staring at her speechless. Sweat ran down his face as he struggled to respond, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Abel asked if he could shift over a bit, snapping him out of his daze. Embarrassed, he moved aside, wondering why he had been staring so blankly at her. Abel told him there was no need to leave the bench completely, just to make a little space. He obliged, still at a loss for words. He shyly wondered what she meant by her spot. Weren't benches public property? Was this something related to the academy's class system? He knew getting involved with Abel, the heroine, would only complicate the main story, so he resolved to avoid her, even though it was awkward. But when he saw her lips, he cursed silently. She really was beautiful. He was startled when Abel mentioned that the spot offered the best view of the stars. He didn't respond immediately, still staring at her and trying to reconcile her appearance with the Abel he knew from the game. The memory of Abel being the swordsman's granddaughter and the protagonist's difficult-to-approach love interest made him uneasy. Abel then asked if his weapon was also a sword, surprising him. When he asked how she knew, she explained that her grandfather had told her. She added that swordmasters had a certain look in their eyes, and as she stared at him, Gyomei felt his face grow hot. She then handed him her sword, offering him the chance to hold it. He took it, commenting that it didn't feel particularly heavy. Abel sulked in response, turning away, leaving Gyomei to wonder if she was really upset. Abel was harder to get used to than he'd anticipated. Was this truly the same Abel he remembered from the game? Abel turned her gaze back to him, asking if he knew who she was. Gyomei wondered if Abel was being suspicious of him, even though there wasn't a single student at the academy who wouldn't know who she was. He responded vaguely, saying he knew her roughly. Abel, however, pointed out that she didn't know him at all, which left him unsure of what she wanted. She remarked that it seemed unfair for him to know her name when she had no idea who he was. When he hesitated, Abel teasingly suggested that he might be a demon lord spy disguised as a student, sneaking into the academy. After all, she continued, there didn't seem to be any other reason for him to be sitting there alone at that hour. Her words left him wondering what she truly meant, but before he could ask, she raised her sword at him, leaving him in disbelief. He tried turning the question back on her, asking what she was doing, but Abel simply replied that she had been exercising and training. Pointing at him, she asked what kind of exercise he had been doing. Flustered, he said he was practicing breathing, which left her momentarily stunned and confused. As the conversation shifted, Geomat noticed wounds on her hands, and when Abel realized he was staring, she quickly hid them behind her back, growing shy and falling silent for a moment. Geomat broke the silence, telling her that she was quite dedicated to her training, to which she agreed. She confessed that few people understood the pressure of inheriting the blood of Nibelung. She felt the need to always be perfect because, in her world, even the slightest flaw could lead to harsh criticism. Abel asked if he knew she wasn't the top student that year. She admitted that losing someone for the first time in her life had been a humbling experience. However, she found it refreshing in a way. Still, she was curious about who had beaten her, vowing to take them down the next time they met. Her bold statement stunned Geomat, causing him to cough in shock. He awkwardly suggested that it wasn't necessary to take them down, but Abel quickly dismissed his words, saying it was a matter of pride. She had even begged her grandfather to tell her who the top student was but found out that they weren't even in her class and had skipped the top student's swearing-in ceremony. Abel expressed disbelief that a second-place student like herself could tolerate such a thing, snapping out of her train of thought. Abel suddenly realized she had been sharing all of this with someone she had just met. Geomat asked why she was telling him all of this, to which she replied that he seemed weak. She went on to explain that her family motto was to be strict with the strong and merciful to the weak, leaving Geomat staring at her in disbelief. Abel added that the students in her class were so bland she didn't really have any friends, making Geomat realize why she had seemed so cold toward the protagonist in the game. Stretching her body, Abel stood up, saying she should head inside and bid him goodbye. Just before walking away, she turned and shouted, asking when he would tell her his name. He responded that he didn't want to, causing her to shout at him in frustration as she left. The next day, Geomat sat in class, reflecting on how his academy life had been flowing by smoothly and steadily. He kept a low profile, especially around Chloe, who had blended in well and even made friends. On the other hand, he avoided eye contact with her out of fear, still shaken by their last encounter. Occasionally, when their eyes did meet, Chloe's new friends would glare at him coldly. However, the disdainful looks didn't bother him much anymore. After all, he wasn't the only exceptional student in the Tiger class, there were simply too few of them, and for some reason, there was a general reluctance among the exceptional students to stand out. Geomat guessed this reluctance stemmed from a kind of inferiority complex. Reflecting on his decision, he felt relieved that he hadn't chosen a higher class. This was the time when students in the Star and Dragon classes began forming factions and engaging in heavy political maneuvering, something that even made Geomat's head spin when he thought about it. Back when he played the game, the intrigue had been enough to make anyone's tongue whack, and as a commoner, the idea of being assigned to those upper classes was chilling. Looking at the black card in his hand, Geomat smiled, feeling glad that he was finally eating well again. He thought about what he should have for today's meal, remembering how the media had given him the card, explaining that it was supposed to be his reward for being the top student. She had apologized for the delay, and now Geomat couldn't help but feel thankful. As he stared happily at the black card, he thought that the level of favor he had received was so great it almost warranted bowing in front of the headmaster's office 3 times a day. For the first time, he sincerely thanked media in his heart. Geomat questioned whether he was faithfully fulfilling his duties as a student. Reflecting on his actions so far, he felt confident that he hadn't done anything to disrupt the main scenario, which gave him a sense of accomplishment. With that in mind, he decided that if he could continue like this for the next 3 years, he might just reach the future he envisioned for himself. Later, during class, their instructor taught them about the history of the First Demon War, which had broken out 700 years ago. The hero Valor Hoken, foreseeing the need to cultivate the next generation of heroes, established the academy with his 7 disciples. The instructor emphasized that this part would be on the exam, but Geomat felt sleepy. He vaguely remembered the details, recalling that Valor Hoken had fought against Leekan, the right-hand man of the Demon Lord and commander of the First Legion. After 20 years of bloody conflict, Valor Hoken emerged victorious, but at great personal cost, he lost an arm and could no longer fight. The war had been brutal, with no clear victor on either side. Fortunately, a ceasefire was reached, and Hoken established the academy to train future generations of heroes. The instructor went on to explain that the First Demon War had resulted in a non-aggression pact between humans and demons, leading to 700 years of peace. One student asked if they would see another war in their lifetime, but his friend jokingly replied that he was more worried about what to wear to tomorrow's party. Geomat, however, knew that the end of this long peace was fast approaching, though no one else seemed to realize it. Everyone had become so accustomed to peace that it felt natural, but Geomat knew better. He considered giving media a hint, but he feared it could lead to unforeseen consequences. The media often spoke about wanting to step down as academy director, but Geomat knew she was crucial to the upcoming events. Her unique divine protection, the poet's blessing, made her the first to detect the impending threat, and she would be the first among the 7-star heroes to rush to the front lines to protect the students. Although Geomat hadn't played that far in the game, he remembered reading on Kumawiki that media would be the first of the 7-star heroes to be sacrificed by the Demon Lord's army. Back then, seeing it online hadn't affected him much, he had simply thought of it as another game event. But now, with everything feeling so real, the thought of media's fate weighs heavily on him. He wished, in some way, that she hadn't been so perceptive. The instructor announced the end of class, reminding everyone to study hard for the midterms in 2 weeks. As students began leaving the room, a commotion stirred outside. Other students asked what was happening, and Geomat, curious, wondered what all the noise was about. Suddenly, someone shouted in excitement, asking if it was them. Alarmed, Geomat quickly checked the date. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. It was May 15th. He rushed out of the room as a crowd began gathering, his mind racing. If his memory served him correctly, today was the day. It was the enrollment date of the world's protagonist, Leon Man Reinhardt, the day when the cracks in the long 700 years of peace would begin to show. He confirms that the protagonist's face is indeed central to the entire plot. He remembers how, in the game, every woman seemed to fall for him. If this game had been adult-rated, Leon wouldn't have needed to fight the Demon King, he'd have died from exhaustion long before that, he thinks with a smirk. He tries to convince himself to think good and kind thoughts because just thinking about Leon makes him imagine explicit scenes. He also recalls that the women drawn to Leon are impressive: Rachel Demora, the niece of the Spear Saint, Saki Ryoso, the daughter of the Bowmaster, and even Abel von Nibelheim, the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor. The so-called protagonist's party members are nothing short of remarkable, which annoys him to no end. Must be nice having a fan club that could double as an elite army, he mutters under his breath. He also knows that Leon van Reinhardt, the protagonist of Miracle Blessing M, will be among the first to be drafted in 3 years. However, calling it a draft is putting it nicely, it's practically mandatory enlistment, something he himself had experienced before. He then wonders just how strong the Demon King must be, considering even Valor Hoken had only managed to seal the 1st Legion commander. He assumes the protagonist won't lose because if that happens, it would be unthinkable. I mean, if the hero loses, who's supposed to pick up the slack? Me? No thanks. Just then, Leon, who was busy talking to a girl, suddenly looks at him, catching him off guard. But Leon flashes a sweet smile, making him feel at ease, reminding him that he's in Miracle Blessing M, where the protagonist will handle everything one way or another. Ah yes, the plot armor smile. It's like he's saying, don't worry, my charisma stat is maxed out. He realizes that Leon's face is almost inspirational, convincing him of this before he even notices it. Suddenly, someone calls out to him from behind, and he turns to see who it is. Later, at the training grounds, he repeatedly swings his practice stick. As expected, pushing beyond his limits doesn't activate his blessing, and he concludes that he needs at least basic swordsmanship skills. He recalls that, a moment earlier, Chloe had approached him, asking if she had done something wrong. He'd wanted to say that his head felt like it was about to part ways with his neck, but knowing they'd be spending the next year together, he simply replied that it was nothing. She asked if he truly meant it, and he said yes, thinking it was best to keep things civil. There was no need to make unnecessary enemies. Rule number 1 of survival, don't upset the girl who looks like she could bench press you, he reminds himself. She sighed in relief, which left him wondering who Chloe really was. Despite her sometimes cold demeanor, he had sensed an air of sorrow in her sword, as if the blade itself was pleading to be saved. Yet, the killing intent radiating from its edge was so intense that it made his skin crawl. Yup, definitely not the type to argue with over dinner plans. She then asked if it was alright to treat him to dinner that evening, explaining that she really wanted to treat him. Shyly, she added that she wasn't as good at cooking as he was. He recalled her cold, murderous stare from before, yet now saw her puppy dog eyes, pleading with him to say yes. Her expression made it difficult for him to refuse, but he knew that, although he felt bad about turning her down. Accepting might result in him waking up in a fridge the next morning. I'd prefer not to become tomorrow's leftovers, he thought to himself. An idea came to him, and he asked if, instead of dinner, he could request a favor. Surprised, she asked what favor he wanted. He replied that she was the only one he could ask. She blushed and shyly asked if he really meant she was the only one, then asked what the favor was. He told her he wanted her to teach him swordsmanship. Knowing that he needed a skilled instructor and that Chloe was incredibly strong, he thought it was a perfect excuse. Plus, I've been watching those How to Survive Yandarith videos. You know, for research. Minutes later, Chloe arrived at the training grounds and asked him how he got there, saying she had been waiting over in a different spot. He replied that he had just arrived and asked when she got there. She excitedly responded that she had also just arrived around 6:30. He reminded her that they weren't supposed to meet until 8, but she only laughed. Ah, early by an hour and a half? Totally not alarming at all. He stared at her for a moment, and she asked if she looked strange. Stammering, he replied no. He hadn't noticed it before, probably because he'd only ever seen Chloe in her school uniform. But now he could see that she had solid muscles, which explained her strength. Despite this, she was still quite cute, and he realized this was a rare opportunity. He handed her the wooden sword, which she accepted, but then she asked if they weren't going to use real swords. He was taken aback, wondering if he had misheard. Did I mishear? Who trains with real swords when they're not actually fighting for their lives? He explained that it was just a training session, and using wooden swords was better to avoid getting hurt. She laughed as if she had just learned something amusing and playfully told him he was nice, which made him feel a bit uneasy. Nice? Is that code for easy prey? He wondered nervously. She then gripped the wooden sword tightly and swung it down, but the force was so strong that it sent a gust of wind through the air, making him sweat in horror. Oh, good, she's going easy on me by creating a personal tornado, he thought, realizing just how powerful she was. Even the air seemed to tremble from her strike. Realizing he needed to be cautious, he checked his blessing again by opening his status window. His body was still growing steadily, and while the sword's length wasn't an issue, he wondered if blessings came with additional effects as they upgraded. A blessing upgrade, maybe something like invincible against crazy sword swingers? That would be nice right about now. He couldn't quite remember as he stared blankly at his status window, pondering how much more he needed to grow for the unknown parts to reveal themselves. Chloe noticed him spacing out. She asked if something was wrong and approached him, her voice snapping him back to reality. He quickly apologized, realizing he was the only one who could see the system and must have looked like he was losing focus. He then told her that, since this was their first lesson, she should take it easy on him. She agreed, and he gripped his wooden sword tightly, raising it as he asked if they could start. Okay, easy mode activated, right? Right? They faced each other, and he remembered that, in his past lives, everything he learned came from hands-on experience. He decided to trust the saying, seeing is believing. To truly master a skill, he knew he couldn't hold back, he had to be ready to dedicate his entire being. It was this mindset that had helped him adapt quickly to the academy, having trained from a young age. As he readied himself, he saw Chloe release a strong aura, and he felt sweat cling to his palms. His stance felt awkward, but he knew the final stroke of a sword must always aim to strike the opponent. Suddenly, she dashed toward him, leaving him stunned. Did she just teleport? Or am I already losing my mind? When her sword was about to hit his head, he barely managed to tilt his head just in time to avoid it. He cursed under his breath in fear, she was incredibly fast. He wanted to remind her that he had asked her to go easy on him. What happened to easy? This is more like hardcore mode. She swiftly caught the sword with her other hand and swung it with great force, making him raise his sword in defense. His arms shook from the impact, but he was relieved that he had finally managed to move in time. Without warning, she appeared above him, leaving him wondering when she had even moved. Is she secretly some sort of ninja? She kept getting faster, and as he swung his sword down to block her strikes, he wondered if the first blow had been the only one she held back. He managed to block her attack, but the force was so great that his wooden sword began to crack. Of course it did. Who knew a light practice session would involve my sword self-destructing? He retreated while continuing to block, realizing that her onslaught wasn't going to stop. Each of her strikes was heavy, and he knew that if he got hit even once, it could be fatal. If I survive this, I'm buying a suit of armor and never leaving the house again. He was nearing his limit, but he couldn't find an opening to counterattack. Finally, his wooden sword snapped in half. Both of them stared at it in shock. Chloe stuttered an apology, explaining that she had tried to go as easy as she could, but ended up breaking it. Breaking my sword is considered easy? I'm almost afraid to ask what difficult looks like, he thought, staring at the broken weapon. She called out to him when he didn't respond, and then she froze in horror as she saw him emitting a powerful aura. The system then showed him that the weapon condition had been met, but it warned him that his weapon had been damaged and an error had occurred. It then indicated that a suppressive force was being used to adjust the user's personality, and his humanity level was decreasing. Oh great, now I'm losing my humanity. How could this day get any worse? Suddenly, he was pulled inside his mind, where he found himself standing in the kitchen from his past life. Confused, he wondered if he had been dreaming this entire time. He remembered cleaning the fish and decided to return to work. Various knives lay on the table before him, and he chose to try the Chinese cleaver since it had been a while since he'd used it. However, he couldn't pick it up. A voice told him that wasn't the one. Okay, spooky voice in my head, cool. Because that's exactly what I need right now, he muttered. Perplexed, he wondered what it meant. He then tried to pick up another knife, but again, he couldn't lift it. The voice repeated that it wasn't the one. He asked aloud who was speaking, but the voice reassured him not to worry and to continue with what he was doing. Finally, he saw that only the sashimi knife remained, and the voice urged him to hold it. He hesitated, saying that holding the sashimi knife would hurt, but the voice asked if that was still true. He picked up the sashimi knife, surprised that he felt completely fine. In fact, he felt refreshed, holding his favorite knife without pain. The voice affirmed that this was the correct choice and told him to let go of everything else. He agreed, saying he would do his best today, unaware that he was being controlled. At that moment, the sword god's divine blessing, malign, activated. Chloe, noticing something was wrong, worriedly called his name and asked if he was alright, but he didn't respond. His eyes glared at her as he suddenly dashed toward her at high speed, slashing his broken wooden stick at her. Fortunately, she blocked it just in time. She shouted for him to wait, but he didn't listen. He struck again, causing her foot to lift off the ground from the impact. The force of his strike sent her flying into the wall behind her, and she coughed up blood. She immediately sensed that something was completely different about him. Before she could recover, he appeared in front of her, attempting to stab her with the broken stick. Luckily, she jumped away just in time and landed safely. He looked around with a vacant, unconscious gaze. Chloe struggled to stand, realizing that she had been struck by his attack and was unable to move properly. She was confused, wondering how he had changed so suddenly, but for now, her priority was to stop the sparring session. Shakily and coughing, she told him they needed to stop, but he dashed toward her again, trying to grab her. Knowing she couldn't avoid it, she desperately shouted for him to stop and come to his senses. She called his name repeatedly, and just as he was about to strike, she screamed his name with every ounce of strength she had left. Meanwhile, inside his mind, he was perplexed by the fish that seemed to be avoiding him. He thought he had never encountered fish like this before, so fast and loud. Frustrated, he decided he had to kill it quickly, but then he noticed something strange. The sound was unnervingly human. He hesitated, wondering if he had made a mistake. The fish began shouting a name, Jio Mao, leaving him even more confused. Then, as he saw his reflection in the sashimi knife, it all came rushing back to him. He was Kong Jio Mao. Regaining control of his body, he looked at the fish in front of him and realized it was Chloe, desperately calling his name to snap him out of it. The stick pierced the wall next to her, missing her by inches. He had come to his senses just in time, preventing a tragedy. Chloe, trembling and in tears, looked up at him, shocked to see him smiling gently as he held her. He softly told her that they should stop for today. Confused, she asked if he was okay. He simply thanked her for helping him train and said he would be heading out first. Without further explanation, he walked out of the training grounds, leaving her stunned and in disbelief. A moment later, Chloe returned to her dormitory, heading to her room while reflecting on her earlier thoughts. Since the entrance exam, she had sensed that Jio Mao's abilities were not just about strength, they were unusual. It wasn't about technique but raw instinct. Even though Jio Mao had unconsciously activated his divine blessing, she had been no match for him. Even with only a broken wooden stick, he had defeated her. As she became lost in her thoughts, someone commented on her content appearance, drawing her attention. She looked up and saw Nox Auditor, a second-year student from the Tiger class, waiting for her. She addressed him as her brother, but he remarked that attending the academy seemed to involve associating with people beneath their status. Chloe tried to defend Jio Mao, telling Nox not to speak about him in that way. But Nox pointed out that if she continued spending time around Jio Mao, their family would take steps to deal with him. Calmly, Chloe walked past Nox, stating, even if the entire auditor family came after Jio Mao, they would be no match for him. Besides, you're more likely to trip over your own ego than actually catch him, she added internally with a smirk. As she walked away, Nox began to wonder more about Jio Mao. Meanwhile, Jio Mao had a realization. He needed to confront the nature of the power he had been given. It was far from a divine blessing or favor, it felt more like a curse. You know it's bad when even your superpower comes with an asterisk. In an attempt to avoid relying on the sword god's power, Jio Mao had sought out new weapons. Yet, that cursed power had pursued him, taking control of his body as if mocking his efforts. He recalled how there had been no pain, only an intoxicating sense of pleasure as the curse manipulated him like a puppet, whispering destructive commands into his mind. He had surrendered to that influence, but then he heard Chloe's frantic cries calling out the name he suddenly remembered as his own, Kong Jio Ma. The sound of his name brought clarity, piecing together his fragmented consciousness. He threw the wooden stick from his hand, feeling as though it had melded with him. Note to self, don't hold cursed sticks, ever again. Instinctively, he knew that if he hadn't let go, he would have lost himself completely. The girl who had tried to harm him not long ago had, in that moment, pulled him back from losing control. Though irritated at first by Chloe breaking the sword, Jio Ma found himself feeling oddly grateful. Who knew nearly dying could improve relationships, he thought with a dry chuckle. He wondered why he hadn't made a bigger deal about the incident. He had left the training ground quickly to prevent the sword god's blessing from activating again, but he questioned whether he could truly keep the curse at bay for the rest of his life. Jio Ma knew that the so-called blessing was more of a curse, one that took pieces of his lifespan as payment. It was something he would be forced to live with as an outsider, cast into a world not his own. He didn't want much, he simply desired a normal life. But, of course, normality is out of stock, and all I got is a world-ending curse on clearance. He thought he could handle small problems as they arose, but now realized there was something inside him that sought to consume his rational mind. The power he had was no blessing. It was a curse intent on devouring him, a force that should never have been bestowed. 3 days later, in the classroom, a classmate mentioned to Chloe that something wild had happened the previous day and suggested she check it out. Chloe replied that she'd look it up later. She glanced beside her but noticed Jioma's seat was empty once again, making her realize she didn't even have his contact information. Maybe I'll just send a carrier pigeon at this rate. She wondered why she hadn't thought to ask for it sooner. Chloe recalled going to Jioma's dorm, but the only response to her knocking had been pained groans. Worried that he might hate her if she broke down the door, she had walked away. She liked watching Jioma from afar, often stealing glances at him when he was lost in thought, his chin resting on his hand. It's like a romantic movie, except instead of candles and flowers, there's bruises and swords. She couldn't even count how many times she'd secretly glanced at him in a single day. Chloe was careful not to talk to him much, afraid he might think she was just some annoying girl. At first, she thought her attraction to him was because he had risked his life for her, but she soon realized that was just an excuse. She simply missed him. The following day, their instructor, Lee, loudly ordered the students to quiet down, angrily asking if they attended such a prestigious school just for show. Yes, professor, I paid for the prestigious diploma package, one student whispered, earning a glare. Lee then informed them that, since it was raining, they would have a study hall instead of training. Lee noticed Jioma was absent again but decided to trust that he had a good reason. As a true educator would, Lee chose to patiently wait for Jioma's return and instructed the students to begin studying. They responded with a unified yes. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Lee furiously demanded to know who had the audacity to enter during class. However, his anger faded as soon as he saw who it was. Never mind, false alarm, carry on, Lee muttered. The entire class turned to stare as Jioma silently walked in, emotionless, with a few strands of white in his dark hair and a scar on his face. Oh great, he's back. Now things are about to get dramatic, one student whispered, earning another glare from Lee. Chloe stood up in shock when she saw him. Jioma calmly approached his desk and apologized to Lee for his lateness. Lee, softening, told him there was no need to apologize and instructed him to sit down, which Jioma did without a word. His classmates whispered to each other, marveling at how he seemed even more handsome despite his changed appearance. It's like he came back from a movie makeover but with scars, one whispered. Jioma remained silent throughout the lesson. After class, as the students hurried out to lunch, Chloe hesitantly approached Jioma, stammering as she called his name. She asked him with clear concern, what happened to you? Jioma replied simply, it's nothing serious. Chloe explained that since he hadn't shown up for a few days, she had worried something might have happened. She asked if it had anything to do with the duel, but Jioma turned to her and said, I've just been a little sick. He thanked her for worrying, and Chloe was stunned by how different he looked up close. How can someone look this good even after being sick, she thought, feeling herself blush harder than ever. Embarrassed, she quickly stammered, I am glad you're okay, though she found it hard to believe that everything was fine. For the past 3 days, Jioma had endured something akin to extreme withdrawal symptoms, leaving him mentally and physically exhausted. He hadn't been able to leave his room or eat, lying in bed, praying for the painful convulsions to stop. Apparently, getting cursed wasn't covered in the school health plan, he thought grimly. The pain was far worse than anything he had experienced before, his body's price for holding and using that broken weapon. But that wasn't all. When Jioma looked at himself in the mirror, his face appeared the same, but his expression was hollow, and streaks of his hair had turned white. It was clear this was a penalty from the so-called sword god. Chloe seemed to feel guilty, likely because the last time she had seen him was when he collapsed at the training ground. Jioma figured it was best to let it go. He then smiled slightly and asked her, hey, do you still mean that offer about dinner? Chloe's face turned even redder, and she stuttered in surprise, dinner? Really? Jioma confirmed with a chuckle, yeah, I'd like to try your cooking this time. Chloe, eager and excited, exclaimed that she'd do her best. Do I even have enough ingredients for something special? She panicked silently, but couldn't hide her joy. She eagerly told him she'd make anything he wanted and asked what he liked. He replied, fish. I haven't had fish in a while. Then, Jioma added casually, last time, I tried eating at the dorm but the meal was so expensive, I ended up throwing it out. Who knew cafeteria food could cost more than my rent? He stopped speaking abruptly when he felt a sharp sensation near his neck. Startled, he immediately glanced to his side. Noticing his shift, Chloe turned to look too. When she saw what had caught his attention, her expression darkened. Standing nearby, glaring at them with a creepy smile, was Nox. Chloe was visibly shocked. Sensing something was off, Jioma asked, do you know him? But kept his eyes fixed on Nox. Without breaking eye contact, Jioma approached Nox and bluntly said, if you've got something to say, just say it. Staring contests aren't my thing. Nox remained silent, continuing to glare, his eyes narrowing with unsettling intensity. Chloe quickly stepped between them and urged Ji-ma not to concern himself with Nox. Addressing Nox as her brother, she reminded him that she had told him not to come. Hearing this, Ji-ma quickly pieced together who Nox was. He noticed Chloe's voice was firm, but there was a slight tremble to it. She demanded to know why Nox was there. But Nox ignored her and instead looked Ji-ma up and down, remarking coldly, "This is the guy? Doesn't seem that impressive. You're really going to break the family rules for him?" Chloe's eyes flared with anger. She shot back, "The auditor family has nothing to do with me anymore." Nox smirked. "You can't wash the blood from your hands, Chloe. Once an auditor, always an auditor." Wow, this guy sure loves his villain speeches, Ji-ma thought, mentally rolling his eyes as Nox's words hung dramatically in the air. Ji-ma watched their interaction, noting how Chloe's defiance made her sound like a rebel protagonist from some epic saga. "Guess I'm caught up in family drama now." "Great." Nox, his glare returning to Ji-ma, said coldly, "Get rid of that thing and come back to the family." Ji-ma's patience wore thin. "Did he just call me a thing?" Before he could respond, Chloe erupted in fury, shouting, "Don't you ever call him that." A powerful wave of force burst from her, stunning both Ji-ma and Nox. As Chloe stood there shaking with rage, Ji-ma, now accustomed to strange tensions, observed quietly. "So, this is the part where things get really intense, huh?" Ji-ma's mind raced as everything clicked into place. The auditor family, long underestimated by many, wasn't weaker than the other heroic houses, they were just different. They didn't boast flashy powers or grand displays of strength. Instead, their power lay in silence, shadows, and ruthless efficiency. Trained from birth, every member was molded into an elite assassin, and Nox, with his cold, empty eyes, embodied that deadly legacy. His demeanor suggested someone for whom killing was as routine as breathing. Ji-ma glanced at Chloe, her lip trembling with anger, biting down so hard it started to bleed. It struck him how she might have longed for an ordinary life, far away from the suffocating world of the auditors. But just like the curse that clung to him, Chloe's upbringing in the auditor clan was something she could never fully escape. Her defiance was admirable, but he knew how inescapable such a fate could be. "What a tragedy," he thought. "Neither of us ever really had a choice." Ji-ma turned to Nox, who stood with that eerie smile, eyes sharp as daggers. He knew what he had to do. The blade on his hip seemed heavier than ever, its cursed power simmering beneath the surface. Addressing Nox, he asked, "You're Nox, right?" Nox gave a short nod, the sinister smirk never leaving his face. Ji-ma thought about the futility of trying to escape his cursed blessing from the sword god. He had tried to run, just like in the old cartoons that said you couldn't find paradise by running away. Guess they were right, he mused. Deciding to face his fate head-on, Ji-ma took a step forward, his voice steady. "Follow me," he said. "I'll cut you." Meanwhile, in the faculty room, Instructor Lee sat at his desk, deep in thought. He replayed the scene in his mind. Ji-ma's expression earlier had been unsettling, completely devoid of any emotion. Something had definitely happened. Just then, his colleague entered with a playful grin. "Lee, you look stressed. Don't tell me you're finally noticing that bald spot," she teased, eyeing the top of his head. Lee's eye twitched in annoyance. "For the last time, stop bringing up the baldness," he grumbled, pushing some papers around. She laughed and offered a half-hearted apology as she sat down. But just then, the phone rang, interrupting their banter. Lee picked it up, introducing himself in his usual gruff tone as the instructor of the Tiger class. His colleague watched as Lee's casual demeanor quickly shifted. His face tightened as he shouted into the receiver, "Subspace? Why are you mentioning subspace all of a sudden?" He demanded more information, his voice growing increasingly agitated. "Which cadet submitted this request? And who's their opponent?" The voice on the other end replied calmly, "Cadet Kong Ji-ma submitted the request. His opponent is Nox Auditor." Lee's face paled in disbelief. "Those two?" His hand shook as he set the phone down, unable to process how serious this was about to get. Later, at the subspace arena, Ji-ma stood alone, staring at the match listings displayed on the board. His name and Nox's were side by side, clear as day. 15 minutes until the duel. Everything had moved faster than he'd anticipated. Funny, I wanted to avoid attention, and now look at this, he thought, glancing at the buzzing crowd in the waiting room. It seemed word of the duel had spread like wildfire, and now he was at the center of it. "So much for staying under the radar," he muttered under his breath. Suddenly, he heard a soft voice calling his name. "Chloe." She stood beside him, shaking, tears streaming down her face. She probably thinks it's her fault, Ji-ma thought, feeling a pang of guilt. Gently, he placed a hand on her shoulder and tried to reassure her. "Hey, it's not your fault, okay? Don't worry about it." He pointed to the small knife she had lent him. "Besides, you even gave me your gear. I'll be fine." Chloe shook her head, still trembling. "No, you don't understand. Nox is incredibly strong." Ji-ma smiled softly. "I'm strong too, you know." But Chloe's eyes widened as she practically shouted, "No, you don't get it. Nox is a genius. He's the strongest the Auditor family has ever produced. When it comes to the dark arts, no one compares to him. She wiped her tears, her voice frantic as she continued. At just 14, they called him the pinnacle of the dark arts. Ji-Oh-ma sighed, feeling both the gravity of her words and a slight tinge of disappointment. Pinnacle of dark arts? Who comes up with these names? He thought back to his own situation, how no matter how much he tried to avoid it, he was always drawn back to wielding a blade. He glanced down at the knife Chloe had given him, the rose blade. Ironic, huh? A cursed swordsman with a blade in hand, destined to fight. As the countdown to the duel began, Ji-Oh-ma knew that whatever happened next, it would define him, Chloe, and Nox in ways none of them could predict. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to lose. No running away this time. Ji-Oh-ma took a deep breath as the host announced the beginning of the duel, trying to focus on the battle ahead. His mind briefly drifted back to his past life, his old master's words echoing in his ears, "You were born to wield a blade." The irony of that statement was now fully apparent. In his next life, he was running into battle with a sashimi knife, of all things. He doubted his master could have ever predicted this. But fate had a strange sense of humor, and Ji-Oh-ma knew that, no matter the weapon in his hand, his path was always the same. His reverie was cut short by the roar of the crowd as the duel was announced. Ji-Oh-ma stood and glanced at Chloe one last time, who still looked as if she couldn't bear to face him. Gently, he called her name, and when she finally looked up, he gave her a soft smile. "Don't worry," he said, with a hint of mischief in his tone. "There are all kinds of geniuses in this world, that's why I'll win." The light of the arena flooded his vision as he stepped out, the crowd's cheers growing louder, almost deafening. Students yelled encouragements, placing their hopes on him. "We knew the special admissions student wouldn't back down," they shouted. Ji-Oh-ma could feel the weight of their expectations, but it only added to the surreal nature of the moment. Is this how gladiators felt, he thought, amused by the sheer intensity of the scene. In the distance, he noticed familiar faces watching from the stands: Leon, Saki, Rachel, and Abel, all observing intently. Abel, in particular, had a serious look, making Ji-Oh-ma wonder why they even cared enough to watch. Don't they have better things to do, he mused, feeling the awkwardness of the situation sink in. But then, Nox's voice cut through the noise, laced with fury. "Are you mocking me?" he yelled, eyes blazing as he glared at Ji-Oh-ma. "You have no idea what you're getting into. That pathetic excuse for a blade, you dare face me with it?" Nox's aura flared, and Ji-Oh-ma felt the full brunt of his killing intent, but instead of backing down, Ji-Oh-ma grinned. "A true master never blames his tools," he quipped, his voice light yet confident. Nox's face twisted in rage, but he quickly composed himself, his cold expression returning. "Fine," he sneered. "I'll make silencing you my first priority." With a menacing glare, Nox unsheathed his katana, the blade humming with dark energy. It was an S-rank weapon, known as the Hungarian blade, and its aura pulsed with the ominous blessing of the Dark Crow, a formidable power. But Ji-Oh-ma wasn't fazed. He knew Nox was strong, probably one of the strongest opponents he'd ever faced. Still, he had no intention of losing. He glanced at the knife Chloe had given him, the rose blade. It might have been unassuming compared to Nox's katana, but Ji-Oh-ma had a feeling there was more to this blade than met the eye. The host called for the duel to begin, and the subspace barrier deployed, surrounding them in an enclosed arena. The audience fell silent, anticipation hanging in the air. Both Ji-Oh-ma and Nox moved before the blessing was even fully invoked, weapons drawn in a flash. Ji-Oh-ma activated his painless blessing and the sword god's blessing simultaneously, feeling the familiar surge of power course through him. As the system's message appeared in his mind, ***, may the blessings of the gods descend upon you, ***, he readied himself for the fight. The audience murmured in confusion, many wondering if they had misjudged Ji-Oh-ma. Some students whispered in disbelief, questioning if the cadet they thought was just a special admissions student was actually far more skilled than they'd assumed. As the clash of blades echoed in the arena, it became clear that this wasn't going to be an easy match. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched the speed and precision of the two duelists. "This is getting interesting," she muttered under her breath. Abel, watching silently, couldn't believe that the boy she had spoken to earlier, the one who seemed so weak, was fighting at this level. Nox unleashed a flurry of powerful strikes, his katana cutting through the air with deadly precision. He swung from right to left, aiming to overwhelm Ji-Oh-ma, but Ji-Oh-ma met each strike with his sashimi knife, countering and deflecting the blows. Nox snarled, bringing his blade down in a vicious vertical slash, but Ji-Oh-ma moved with fluid grace, countering again, this time from the left. The force of the clash sent a shockwave through the arena, and Nox, growing impatient, tightened his grip and swung his second blade, only for it to slam into the ground as Ji-Oh-ma sidestepped. Nox's attacks grew more relentless, his fury evident as he swung faster and harder, desperate to break through Ji-Oh-ma's defense. But Ji-Oh-ma's movements were smooth, almost effortless. In a blink, Ji-Oh-ma vanished from Nox's sight, slipping away like a shadow. Nox cursed, scanning the area frantically, wondering how Ji-Oh-ma had evaded his onslaught. "Where is he?" Nox growled, eyes darting around the arena. Just as Nox's frustration peaked, he charged forward, activating his three-legged crow technique, a technique designed to close the distance between him and his opponent at blinding speed. His blades formed a deadly pattern, a web of strikes that seemed impossible to avoid. Gyoma appeared to be cornered, the finishing blow imminent. But in the moment before Nox's strike landed, Gyoma disappeared again, moving at a speed so incredible that even Nox's eyes couldn't keep up. "What the?" Nox shouted, staring at the empty space where Gyoma had just been. Shock and disbelief washed over him as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. Gyoma, appearing several feet away, stood calmly, his blade ready. "Is that all you've got?" he said with a smirk, his voice mocking yet calm. Nox's eyes widened in fury, and in that instant, Gyoma knew the real fight had only just begun. Gyoma reappeared at Nox's side, locking eyes with him, his expression calm but filled with quiet resolve. Nox, on the other hand, was seething with frustration. The spectators, especially the sophomores, couldn't take their eyes off the duel, marveling at how Gyoma, a freshman, was holding his own. One student whispered to his friend that freshmen usually ran from these kinds of fights. "Sophomores dominate," his friend added. But Abel, watching closely, knew they were missing the point. Though Nox was attacking ferociously, it was Gyoma who was effortlessly dodging and evading, making her wonder if he was even trying to counterattack. Nox's anger boiled over as he remembered Chloe's warning that Gyoma wasn't ordinary. His pride stung, especially after using the blessing of the crow to no avail. Watching Gyoma's precise, almost casual movements only deepened his frustration. Every strike Nox launched was skillfully evaded, as if Gyoma could see them coming a mile away. Then, Nox's rage hit its peak when Gyoma did the unthinkable, he dropped one of his sashimi knives. For a moment, Nox froze in disbelief, wondering what kind of trick Gyoma was playing. "What are you planning?" he demanded, his suspicion laced with anger. But Gyoma remained silent, reaching for Chloe's rose blade, gripping it with both hands and leveling it at Nox. Nox's confusion turned to outrage. "Mocking me with that stance? You have no right." Nox's voice echoed through the arena as he prepared for his final strike. His blade began to morph, sprouting dark crow wings from its hilt that spread across his back. The transformation fueled his anger further as he swore to cut Gyoma down in a single blow. "What can you do against my Hungarian blade?" he sneered. But before Nox could finish his thought, Gyoma blurred into motion, moving with such speed that it took Nox a second to register what had happened. In an instant, Gyoma was in front of him, rose blade poised for a strike. As Gyoma prepared to land the blow, his mind drifted for a brief moment. "All I ever wanted was peace." His life had been a constant struggle, one where he tried to follow the rules and avoid the spotlight. But it never worked. That cursed blessing, his fate, had always chased him. He had tried to hold back, to run away. But in this moment, Gyoma finally gave in. If he couldn't run from his fate, he would embrace it, cutting through everything in his path. With a single, clean slash, Gyoma severed Nox's arm before Nox could even react. Silence fell over the arena. The students, the elites in the stands, and even Leon were frozen in disbelief. Gyoma stood motionless, his stance calm, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The arena was heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Nox stumbled, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at his severed arm on the ground. But before he could utter a curse or even comprehend what had just happened, Gyoma moved again, slashing through Nox's body with rapid precision, leaving him utterly defenseless. With each slice, Nox's form crumbled, and then, without hesitation, Gyoma delivered the final blow, decapitating Nox with a swift strike. The crowd gasped as the host announced that the subspace barrier had been deactivated. Smoke billowed from the stage, obscuring the view. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone anxiously awaited the result. As the fog cleared, Nox was revealed standing, unharmed, the subspace having restored his body to its original state. Gyoma calmly sheathed the rose blade, and as he did, a powerful force radiated from it, sending a shockwave through the arena. The host, stunned, declared the duel over, announcing the winner, Kong Gyoma, freshman of the Tiger class. The arena erupted in cheers, students in awe of the freshman who had just bested a sophomore elite. Gyoma glanced at the crowd, somewhat bemused by their excitement. So much for blending in, he thought with a wry smile. He couldn't help but think that companies could learn a thing or two about creating buzz from this kind of spectacle. But deep down, he knew there was no turning back now. He had crossed a line, and the peaceful life he had once longed for was nothing more than a distant memory. Gyoma glanced at his knife, the one meant for gutting fish, not for battle. Cutting people feels so unpleasant, he mused, though it was hard to ignore the ease with which he had dispatched Nox. He took solace in the fact that, thanks to the subspace barrier, no real harm had been done. As he watched Nox, visibly shaken despite his intact body, Gyoma realized that Nox had been strong, just as Chloe had warned. Yet, Nox's reliance on raw killing intent had been his downfall, allowing Gyoma to outmaneuver him. The duel was over, but Gyoma's journey had only just begun. He could no longer run from the power that had been bestowed upon him, nor the destiny that followed. The news of Nox's defeat spread through the academy like wildfire the next day. Gyoma's name was on everyone's lips, especially once they learned Nox was from the prestigious auditor family. A freshman taking down a sophomore of Knox's caliber was almost unheard of. In the midst of this, Abel sat at her desk, deep in thought. She couldn't shake the image of Gioma slicing through Knox as if he were nothing. The skill he displayed, using nothing more than kitchen knives, was unbelievable to her. Abel prided herself on her sword knowledge, given her lineage as the granddaughter of a swordmaster. Yet, Gioma had effortlessly surpassed her expectations, shattering her previous notions. As she replayed their last conversation in her mind, she recalled his cryptic statement about wanting to crush the one who defeated him. Abel had thought little of it at the time, dismissing him as cocky. But now, she knew better. Gioma had likely been the top student all along, stronger than even she had anticipated. The realization gnawed at her pride, filling her with frustration. She abruptly stood up, her voice bursting out. "What were you thinking, Gioma?" Rachel, still half asleep, blinked up at her. "What's going on?" she asked groggily. Abel, suddenly aware of her outburst, quickly apologized. "Nothing, it's nothing," she muttered, waving it off. Rachel, sensing something off, squinted at Abel. "You sure? You look like something's eating at you." Abel brushed it off again, claiming she was just feeling sluggish due to a lack of training. But Rachel wasn't convinced. "You sure that's all?" she pressed, a playful glint in her eyes. "Your face says you're hiding something." Abel deflected. "What do you mean by that?" Rachel grinned. "Maybe you're hungry? Or maybe..." She paused dramatically. "Left your gear at home?" Abel sighed, shaking her head. "No." Rachel smirked, narrowing her eyes. "Or maybe, it's boy trouble." Abel froze, her cheeks flushing. What? "No," she stammered, much too quickly. Seeing Abel's reaction, Rachel's grin widened. "Oh, this is interesting. You're blushing. I didn't think Lady Abel was the type for romance." Abel's voice rose, defensive. "It's not what you think." Rachel, unbothered, leaned in with a sly grin. "So who's the lucky guy? Must be special if he's got you this worked up." She tapped her chin in thought. "Could it be Leon?" "No." Abel's answer came faster than expected, making Rachel even more curious. Then maybe." Rachel's eyes lit up as the idea hit her. "Could it be the special student from yesterday? The black-haired guy?" Abel froze again, this time visibly stopping in her tracks. Rachel's smile widened, clearly pleased with herself. She grabbed Abel's arm. "Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's go see." Before Abel could protest, Rachel had dragged her off to the tiger class. Where are we going?" Abel stammered, still trying to process the situation. "To find that black-haired fella, of course," Rachel said, full of excitement. When they arrived, the entire tiger class was stunned to see Abel and Rachel in their midst. Abel tugged at Rachel's arm, whispering that they should leave, but Rachel marched forward confidently. "So, where's the black-haired guy?" she called out, scanning the room, ignoring Abel's growing embarrassment. A male student stepped forward, reprimanding Rachel for standing on someone else's desk. "Even someone of your status should show respect." Rachel winked at him. "Don't you think I'm pretty, though?" The poor student stammered, "Yes, but..." Abel groaned, covering her face in mortification as Rachel continued to stir things up. Then Rachel spotted Gioma sitting with Chloe at a nearby table. She raised an eyebrow, briefly wondering if Chloe was his girlfriend, but quickly decided it didn't matter. In fact, it made things even more amusing. Without warning, she strolled up to them, loosening her tie as she leaned down and kissed Gioma on the head. Chloe's laughter died instantly, her eyes widening in shock. Abel froze too, staring in disbelief. Gioma, groggy from a nap, blinked up at Rachel, his brain struggling to catch up. Chloe, her voice soft but taut with tension, managed to ask, Did she just wake you up?" Rachel, completely unfazed, smiled sweetly at Gioma. "Kang Gioma, right?" She tilted her head, taking in his features. "You're even better looking up close." Gioma's instincts flared, this was not a safe situation. But before he could react, Chloe grabbed Rachel's hand, her glare sharp enough to cut. "What do you think you're doing?" Chloe demanded, her voice low but laced with anger. Rachel met Chloe's eyes, her mischievous grin never wavering. "Oh, just checking out the competition. Is there a problem?" The tension between the two girls was palpable, and Gioma, caught in the middle, could only sigh internally. Why can't things ever be simple? This concludes the latest chapter, and we will be continuing it from here in the next episode.